Okay guys, so in class we learned about 4 different types of valve problems: mitral stenosis, mitral regurg, aortic stenosis, and aortic regurg. First ones I want to talk about have to do with the mitral, so just ignore the aortic ones for now. So focusing on mitral stenosis and mitral regurg, we see that mitral stenosis happens with diastolic and mitral regurg happens with systolic, and I'm about to show you why. So first things first, to notice that when we say something happens a systolic murmur or a diastolic murmur, we're talking about the ventricles, because everything we talk about in reference to is always about the ventricles. So if the ventricles are in diastole and the atria are in systole, we call it diastole because that's what the ventricles are doing. So here we see that in systole, or ventricle systole, we're going to hear the regurg, and in ventricular diastole, we're going to hear stenosis. So let's talk about this one first, diastole with stenosis. So if the ventricle is in diastole, that automatically means that the atria are in systole. And in systole, we know that the blood from the atrium is being squeezed into the ventricle. So that means that the ventricle is relaxing while that's happening. So in order for the blood to get from the atrium to the ventricle, it needs to go through the mitral valve. And the mitral valve is stenosed, meaning it's too hard and it won't open properly. Then the blood is not going to be able to flow well from the atrium into the ventricle, and you're going to hear the kind of sounding thing, murmur, because it's a large volume trying to fit through a small opening. So that is why you hear the stenosis during the ventricular diastole. Now the next one is when the ventricle is in systole, you're going to hear regurg. So when the ventricle is in systole, that means the atria are in diastole, and the point of the ventricle being in systole is to get the blood that is now here into the aorta. So in order for that to happen, this valve needs to now shut so that when it squeezes, the blood only goes up through this one, which will be open, and this one will be shut, so when the ventricle squeezes, the blood doesn't regurg back into the atrium where it doesn't belong. So if this one is having regurg, it means it's having a problem shutting. That means during systole of the ventricle, you're going to hear the blood not only squirting up into the aorta, but squirting back into the atrium as well. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about aortic stenosis and aortic regurgitation. We notice that they flip-flop compared to the mitral. So we notice here with mitral stenosis, that happens in diastole. So you might assume that in atrial stenosis, you're going to hear it in diastole, but that's not the case. It flip-flops. You're going to hear the aortic stenosis in systole versus diastole, and I'll explain why. Okay, so if you look at this key here, systole of the ventricle is when we're going to hear the stenosis. And in diastole of the ventricle, we're going to hear the regurg. So let's talk about why. First, let's start with diastole. So the ventricle is in diastole because we always say diastole and systole in reference to the ventricle. So the ventricle is in diastole, meaning that this is going to have to be closed off and this one's going to be open, because that means that atria is squeezing now. This is in systole, squeezing the blood through the mitral into the ventricle. So the reason why this one is closed is so that the blood from the aorta will not fall back through it into the ventricle. If it does, that means that we are experiencing regurg. This one is having a failure to close. So all the blood in the aorta is going to fall back into the ventricle, and that's the murmur you're going to hear. On the flip side, when the ventricle is in systole, you're going to hear the stenosis of the aortic valve. So if the ventricle is in systole, it's trying to squeeze all the blood that's in here through the aorta to the rest of the body. So if this is having a failure to open, it's going to be just like when we talked about the mitral, a large amount of volume trying to fit through a small opening, so that's when you're going to hear that murmur.